Two chapters left. It's time to wrap up the story of Black Star by Hasotobi. Chapter 17. When he awoke for the final time, the bus had gone silent. The engine not stalled, but ceased. There was a certain contentedness to the way it settled, like a dog in front of a fireplace. He worked a kink out of his neck as Lavenza beamed. And so we come to the end, she said. My master awaits. He will guide you to the waking world. His last impression had been of the falling sky. The dilapidated false Tokyo smashing through nothingness just overhead. Roaring water, panic chatter, on silent beside him but hyperventilating like a train engine. He knew it wouldn't have helped anyone if he'd lost his cool, and so he'd shut his eyes and waited for whatever would come. Until Akechi had called out to him. He stretched out in the chair, arched his back, felt his vertebrae pop. He still felt the soreness from those grasping chains. How much time has passed since we stole the treasure? He asked. Barely a day. Your awakening should coincide with that of the other victims. Good. I don't want to worry them any more than I already have. He relaxed again. Though I guess it was for the best in the end. If I hadn't gone into the Dead Sea, then everyone else wouldn't have been spurred into action like that. She nodded, but hesitantly. Akira's thumbs traced abstract patterns in the plush of his armchair. His expression was thoughtful, almost grim. Even she could tell it was inappropriate for someone who had just saved the world. Does something trouble you? I'm just thinking about what you said before, he said. The days to come, where we go from here. You are doubtful of humanity's future? Always. That's just how it is. It's like Rigoro said. People will forget about all this, eventually. They have to. Until we find ourselves back at the same place again and again. He leaned forward, steepled his fingers. Don't worry. I'm not going to despair, like that chatty book wanted. But I'm wondering what to do between now and then. Whatever you choose, I am sure that your efforts will bear fruit. You are one who has completed his rehabilitation, after all. I'm not sure if rehabilitation ever ends. For any of us. That thing, Hastur or Iago, or whatever it was, said there was something twisted at the core of humanity. Something irreparable. It might have laid things on a little thick, but I don't believe it was completely wrong. I mean, I just spent the last couple of weeks splashing around a giant graveyard of distorted thoughts. It probably got smashed to bits when Shimizu's palace collapsed, but there'll be a new one. At another time, in another shape. Nothing stays gone, and nothing stays fixed. He met her eyes, and his gaze was steely. So that just means I have to keep trying to help wherever I can. And I think I just came up with a good place to start. He flashed that wry grin. R.I.P. Sorry. I know you already chewed me out for that attitude before. Old habits die hard, right? Lavenza didn't answer right away. Her smile had gone. She laid her hand on the book between them. Trickster, she said. Please forgive me. Huh? As I told you before, I am a wielder of power, a being created to serve humans, yet forever placed apart from them. Our understanding of the human heart is limited. I thought I had gained some knowledge during our time spent in the Velvet Room. But as I accompanied you here, I came to realize that this knowledge was very shallow, sparse, bereft of the myriad contradictions that had once hindered the heart it guided forward. For example, observe yourself. That incorrigibly selfish altruism. Incorrigibly. She smiled, but it was unlike her other, uncanny, stiff expressions. Her whole face trembled, like she was struggling to keep it in place. She ran a finger across the book's cover, and sparks trailed around her touch. I suppose that I, who was divided by the usurper and then rejoined, resurrected through contradiction, have become fascinated by such paradoxes. And there is still so very much to learn. So forgive me. Even though your journey is concluded, I wish... Her voice shook, then broke. I wish that we had more time. Akira watched dumbfounded as she sniffed and clumsily wiped her eyes. For all his social graces, he had little experience with comforting little girls. Hey, it's all right. For all we know, I might wind up back here again. She lowered her hands and shook her head, smiling through her tears. No, you have been a cherished guest, but I truly hope this is the end of your time here. You have suffered tribulation enough in this realm. Better that you expend your efforts in the waking world from this point forward. She stood up from her seat, stepped to the side of the table. After a moment, Akira followed suit, looking down at her. Nevertheless, she said, the Velvet Room shall remain open. In time, another guest will come, one who rises to challenge the monster known as thyself. Akira nodded and held out his hand. Lavenza stared at it, puzzled. Then she took it and gently guided it up, pressing it to her cheek. She shut her eyes as if his palm were a pillow, about to settle in for a night's rest. Such warmth, she said. I do not understand how you can bear it. She released him and stepped back. Please remember to treasure that flame within you. Humanity will have more need of it than ever in the days to come. I will, he said. Thank you for everything, Lavenza. She curtsied. And best of fortune to you, Akira Kurusu. He walked past her and through the fogged glass barrier separating the two of them from the driver. The driver himself turned out to be a slim and sharp-faced man, his slicked-back hair resting under an old-fashioned driver's cap. His overcoat and gloves were the same deep blue as Lavenza's dress. He shared that white blonde hair, those eyes of beaten gold. He turned his head the merest fraction towards Akira at as the partition's door hissed shut behind him. Good evening, sir. I trust the ride was a pleasant one. Very. Got a little bumpy towards the end, though. My deepest apologies. I shall strive to do better in the future. That's all we can hope for, right? He waved and turned to the stairs. Good night. To you as well, sir. He stepped off the bus and into darkness so thick it was almost solid. But this wasn't the hostile, carnivorous dark of the Black Star. It embraced him like a blanket, slowly pushed him forward. He followed that pressure towards a distant sound that became clearer as the wall solidified in a pitted blue stone. Applause. Was that a new Velvet attendant being the driver, or a Velvet attendant already established? Not sure we'll know. In the prison, Igor stood behind his desk. Between the tuxedo-clad twigs of his legs and his frozen expression, and his body motionless, except for his wild clapping, he came off as some nightmarish cousin of a wind-up cymbal monkey. But as Akira approached and he settled back into his chair, the delight in his voice was full, genuine, and contagious. "What remains to be said?" He spread his arms wide. "You were absolutely magnificent." Akira grinned. "I do my best." Then he looked up, and his grin faded. The stark chandelier of Akechi's cage hung above them, now attached by just a single chain, whose links were badly rusted and creaked dangerously with every breeze. Akechi himself was curled up at the bottom, still in prisoner's fatigues, sleeping deep. "Do not mind him," said Igor. "His confinement will not last much longer, but it should hold for the duration of your stay here." "Would you say he's been rehabilitated?" "That, I believe, is largely up to him." Akira appeared satisfied with that answer. He stepped up to the desk. Igor regarded him, steepling his fingers. "Seems like forever ago since I woke up here," he said. "Right after Futaba called me, right? The book ends to the Velvet Journey." "Indeed. You will depart from this dream shortly, and once this Velvet Room's own guest next awakes, the room itself shall have served its purpose. In all likelihood, you and I will not meet again." "I thought about that, actually," Akira interrupted. His tone was pleasant, but there was a certain sharpness in his stare that held its own against even Igor's pop-eyed expression. "If I hadn't come here when I did, and decided to go to the Dead Sea, all my friends never would have been so determined to look into Paranoia Syndrome further. All the research they did, the way they came there to save me, let alone everything involving Goro, it all happened because I wound up in the Velvet Room that wasn't even my own. That's one hell of a coincidence." "You do seem to attract them, yes." Igor stayed jovial, but there was a note of caution in his voice. "So, I have a question for you." Akira placed his palms on the table and leaned down, almost close enough for his nose and Igor's to touch. "Was it really a coincidence?" he asked. "Did I come here of my own free will, or was I summoned?" Complete stillness. For a long time, that high, sweet note hanging in the air was the only sound. A vibrato string filled with tension. Then Igor laughed, rueful and low. "Dear, oh dear." He shook his head. "Was it so obvious?" "Not really. But I had plenty of time to think, after Shimizu got a hold of me. I thought it was strange enough how the Phantom Thieves got started, just because we bumped into Shido at some fancy buffet. There's only so much that can be left to chance." A fair assumption. Indeed, I confess. I elected to draw you into this velvet room at a time when I thought you would be most amenable to confronting that malicious paranoia. He sighed. From the beginning, I had my suspicions regarding the true nature of your latest foe, an entity I have encountered before, and one I detest even more strongly than the usurper. I believed it vital to unravel its schemes with all possible haste. Nevertheless, it was an unacceptable overreach of authority on my part. I expect to be reprimanded for it later. He held out a hand. And my deepest apologies to you as well. You have already been deceived once by the Velvet Room. I knew it would be a terrible sin to further betray your trust. It's okay, said Akira. He straightened again. It's not like you didn't warn me what would happen. And it all worked out in the end, right? Igor relaxed. We are in agreement, then. I am most pleased that this has not tarnished our relationship any further, but, he added, I'd like to ask you a favor. Igor's eyes somehow widened further, which placed him in serious danger of exiting his malformed skull entirely. The bony rattle of Akechi's cage punctuated his surprise. Then, he tented his fingers, tilted his head. Well, this too is most extraordinary. I would be glad to hear your request, though I must warn you, my influence outside of this room is rather limited. I'm sort of making this up as I go along, but it should work. Tell me then. Akira told him. It took some time. Igor remained motionless for his entire explanation. When at last he finished, one of those emaciated hands rose and curled contemplatively under his chin. The hand was all that moved, as if his consciousness had come to reside fully in that single limb. Fascinating, he said finally. A bold proposal, to be certain. But do you know what he wants? I have an idea, but I can't be sure. I need to confirm it. If you're watching me as closely as I think you are, we'll both get our answer, and we'll both know what to do next. The effect will be quite limited, of course. Quite brief, but if preparations are taken, it would surely be sufficient. And what better way to purge the usurper's influence for good? For good, once and for all. To desecrate his memory so. He chuckled, but there was a hungry undercurrent in his laughter now. The whole room seemed to ripple from it. How utterly tantalizing. I shall have to seek dispensation for this trickster, but I accept. Good. Then we're even. Indebted to a guest. What a novel sensation. I have seen many champions come and go, but please believe me when I say that, even by those lofty standards, you have been truly exceptional. The prison grew indistinct. Akira didn't feel tired or that he was waking, but the world around him became harder to hold on to. Every point of focus skittered away to the edges of his vision. The cells, Igor, Akechi high above, all of it started to run like wet paint, until there were only whirls of deep blue and the worldless song in the panopticon's highest reaches. The seas are calmed. Your task is complete, and our time has, regrettably, come to an end. In these last moments, as Igor joined the blurring blue, Akira had the sensation that he was much taller than he first appeared. Soon, my observation of you will cease entirely. But I believe that you will continue to make yourself known in the waking world. I need only look for the souls you kindle in your wake. We in the Velvet Room bid you farewell. In this uncertain future, may you grasp happiness. Goodbye, Igor. Thank you for everything.